Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the very first session of Academy Breakfast Club, our new online series in which we ask scientists self-isolating at home to change out of their pajamas long enough to talk to you about their areas of expertise. Our first guest is Dr. Nathalie Nagalingum, Botany Curator at the California Academy of Sciences. Hi, Nathalie.
Hi.
And the way this will work is super informal. Basically, if you're watching this live, whether on Facebook or YouTube, you can go ahead and leave a question in the comments section anytime you like during the broadcast. We'll keep an eye on those questions, and then at the end of Nathalie's talk, we will loop back to ask her a bunch of them. The last thing I'll mention quickly is that Nathalie can't see you or me or anyone except herself as she's talking, which is obviously pretty awkward. So even if you don't have a question, feel free to jump into the comment section and just leave a hello or a high five so that she knows that there are humans out there. And without further ado, I'll go ahead and hand this over to Dr. Nathalie Nagalingum with Shady Characters, The Secret Lives of Ferns.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Laurel. Hello, welcome to my living room, well, my kitchen, really. And I am so thrilled to talk to you about ferns. I totally love ferns. So I grew up in the 70s and the 80s, and one of the shows I absolutely loved was Wonder Woman. She was in Australia. She was on every Sunday evening about 5 p.m. And she was super kick-ass, and she had this amazing invisible plane. And actually, I just saw online that the new Wonder Woman may feature her invisible plane. So that might be out soon, a new invisible plane. But so that we've always sort of been fascinated about trying to become invisible. And so even before that, this is like before my time, there was another series called The Invisible Man. And you can see that there's a guy and he's got no head because he's invisible. And then they would put makeup on him so that they could make him visible. And of course, more recently, you know, Harry Potter, he had the invisibility cloak and he used it all over Hogwarts. So it's not really unique to sort of any generation about becoming invisible. And even in Shakespeare's time, people were obsessed with becoming invisible. And the way they wanted to become invisible wasn't through invisibility cloaks or an invisible jet. It was through what they thought was fern seed. And in Henry IV, there's a bunch of guys trying to do something a bit dodgy, and they have a line where they say, "We have receipt of the fern seed, we walk invisible." And so that allows them to then go and do, basically go somewhere and be unseen. And the reason Shakespeare wrote this is because back then in the 1600s, they thought that if you had a fern seed, you would become invisible. And the reasoning was that nobody had ever seen a fern seed. And so they decided that if you found a fern seed, that was how you became invisible, because fern seeds were invisible. But it was really hard to get a fern seed, of course, because they were invisible. And so there was a particular formula with this. What you had to do was you had to get 12 pewter plates, put it under a fern, and only on midnight, June the 23rd. So that's coming up later in the year, so maybe we could all do that. But you have to go under a fern with these plates. And Midsummer Night's Eve is when all the goblins are out, and it was under on the 12th fern plate that you would catch the fern seed. So on the 12th plate, if you didn't find a fern seed, then it was likely the fairies or goblins that had stolen the fern seed. So that's why you failed in finding the seed. But really, it was only until the late 1700s that we discovered that fern seeds were actually spores. There was no such thing as a fern seed. It was what these people called fern dust. And so on the underside of ferns, there's structures, and those structures become new ferns. They didn't exactly know how. And it was this guy, George Lindsay, in the late 1700s. He was in Jamaica. He was actually a doctor, a medical doctor. And he was interested in botany, and he found that if he got the fern seed, the fern dust, and he grew them, somehow he was able to grow ferns out of them. And so he actually was then able to send the fern dust back to England for some new specimens of some Jamaican ferns to grow back in London. So this was like a huge breakthrough. They had finally figured out how to grow ferns. But they didn't really know how it worked. And it was only quite a bit later, about 50 years later, that this guy, he's a Polish baron, and he was looking under a microscope and discovered fern sex. And what he found was this particular life cycle. Now, we humans have a life cycle, and we have sort of our main, the human generation that we see, and it's pretty so straightforward in terms of our eyes. But the fern life cycle has all these different components to it. And so what this Polish baron discovered was that there is this phase in the life cycle called the gametophyte. So the spores, so the fern dust over with those little dots, they grow into these gametophytes, these heart-shaped structures. And it's these heart-shaped structures that actually undergo sex. So you have the sperm produced down here in this heart-shaped structure, and then up here are the eggs. And so what happens is that sperm is released and it swims down these little tubes, and it fertilizes the eggs. And so the sperm is actually kind of little curly things that can travel in ferns. And so then when you get the fertilization, then you actually get a fern plant. And so it grows out of that heart-shaped structure into those ferns that we see today. And so the ferns that you have in your kitchen and your living room and your bathroom, they're actually asexual. They don't reproduce sexually. It's only these tiny little heart-shaped structures, which are really, really, really tiny, sort of the size of your fingernail. Those are the ones that undergo sex. And so it's really interesting to think about the way that plants do sex is completely different to how we, or mammals, and we think of sex. So there's sort of many, many ways that you can have sex through the kingdom of life. And so all of these ferns do pretty much the same thing. There's about 12,000 species worldwide. We're still discovering new species, and there's all these different kinds of ferns that exist. So you have ferns that grow on the ground, which we call terrestrial ferns. We have pretty spectacular tree ferns, and so they just grow vertically and they look like a tree. That's just one group of ferns. There's this group called the king ferns. They have these huge leaves. This is all one leaf. There's epiphytic ferns that they grow on top of other plants. There's cute little aquatic ferns. They grow on the water. And then there's climbing ferns that twirl around branches and grow up towards the light. One of the fern groups I wanted to tell you about today, because I think they're super exciting, is the Gaga ferns. And these are a group of ferns named after Lady Gaga. They were discovered by actually my former postdoc advisor and her PhD student called Fei Wei. And what they found was these ferns had a unique stretch of DNA. When all of the base pairs are different letters, and in this group of ferns, they had this unique stretch that spelt Gaga. And so they thought it was perfect because that fitted in with the fact that they all love Lady Gaga. They would play Lady Gaga in the lab while doing lab work. And at that time, Lady Gaga had a costume that looked exactly like a fern gametophyte, so that heart-shaped structure. So it all fit together. And the fact that ferns were bisexual and they do sex in different ways, and Lady Gaga supports LGBT+, they were just like, this is perfect. We are honouring her by naming these ferns after her. So there's about 19 species of ferns named Gaga. And so just like we're Homo sapiens, these are Gaga germinata. And so this is an example of one of them, one of the Gaga ferns. They grow in South America and Central America. And the two species that they named especially was Gaga germinata, and so that's Lady Gaga's last name, and Gaga monstrapava. Literally, monstrapava means monster little. And so these are for all the Lady Gaga fans. the little monsters. And so we name ferns based on what their leaves look like, and there's a huge range of leaf morphology. That's the sort of appearance of leaves. And I think they're absolutely stunning and really beautiful. We also name ferns and we figure out how the different species are separated from each other by the reproductive structures. So this is where the ferns initiate the production of the spores. Each of those structures, those blobs, is a sorus. The plural is sori. And I'm going to show you a few different sori and different species, so you can get an idea of the kind of variety of species, the variety of sori that you can see. When we turn over that leaf, the sori form these sort of knobby things on the top of the leaf. So that was like a rounded sorus. In this case, the sorus is sort of longitudinal. It's like a big long line across the veins. And there's multiple. In this case, there's one long sorus. This is across the midvein. And in this case, there's lots of sori all scattered all over the leaflet. And so they look like little fuzzy blobs. So you can see there's a really big variety. And so that's how we figure out what species sort of form the same group or same genus. When you look closely at each of those little blobs, there's more little blobs inside them. So one sorus, one little blob, consists of all these little capsules, and each little sort of circle is called a sporangium, and plural is sporangia. These are all these crazy terms. But each sporangium, each little capsule, it looks like it has like a little mohawk on the top of it, which is super cute. So the mohawk there's a mohawk on each individual capsule. When we look at this under the light microscope, and so this is one of these microscopes that uses like fluorescence, and different structures fluoresce in different ways because they're made of different compounds. And so the mohawks fluoresce green, and then inside them you can see the brownish spores, and those spores are then what get released. So the sorus has the capsules, the sporangium with the mohawk, and the sporangium has the spore, and the spore is what then goes on to produce that heart-shaped structure. So the sporangium releases the spores, and those spores get dispersed by the wind, and they go everywhere, and then that's what germinates into that heart-shaped structure and then has sex. And so I have this video, let's see if I can play it, to show you what that sort of opening of the sporangium looks like. Oops, let me see, here we go. So you can see, so as it dries out, the sporangium opens and it flicks the spores. You can see it go, pew! And so this happens in all of the sporangia in the sorus. And so you can imagine, here's another one opening. So it like it opens and then it flicks it like a catapult. So you can see all the spores are completely gone. So it's pretty amazing how this happens, and it allows spores, because these spores are so tiny, they end up on the wind and end up going all over. So ferns end up in all these different places and are able to grow in so many places because those spores just go everywhere. Another group of spores belong to the club mosses, and these are kind of distant relatives of the ferns. But I wanted to show you these ones because these are really fascinating. We use these Lycopodium spores in capsules. So if you have a capsule, sometimes they're coated in these spores so that so you can actually swallow them much more easily. But before we had flash photography, before we had our smartphones, we had cameras that we needed a flash for, and before electricity, what people used were these spores. And so this guy has an old sort of oldies-timey camera over here, and this is a Lycopodium spore flash. And so a couple of years ago, what I did was I bought some Lycopodium spores, And this is the Cal Academy over here. I'm in my living room right now, but this I took a couple of years ago. This is at night time, and I've got like a little squeezy bottle in my hand. And this is my partner Magnus, and he is lighting a match. And I'm going to squeeze the spores out of that squeezy bottle, and we're going to see what happens. So there you go. So there's the flash. I'm going to play that again because that's so cool. And so this is what people used for flash photography before there was electricity. That's pretty impressive. And you can see why I had to do it outside of the academy, and I wasn't allowed to do it inside. And so those belong to the lycopods. And so those are a different group of plants called the lycophytes, and there's about 1,000 species of those. And this is what we call like a family tree of the vascular plants, or the plants that have pipes in them. And so we can see that ferns in this family tree are most closely related to a group of plants called the horsetails, and these are these ones here. And then the ferns and the horsetails are actually closely related to seed plants, and they're distantly related to this group called lycophytes. So as you can tell, I'm sure you figured out that I absolutely love ferns. This was me in my favourite fern dress. I absolutely love this dress. This is a lady that I used to work with. She had this platter of fern that she had brought to a party. This is when I worked in Sydney. And I was raving about how beautiful it was. And she said, well, you can have it. So she gave me this beautiful fern platter. It's actually interesting. It's a pewter platter. So maybe I should use that to catch the fern seed on the 23rd this year. And so that's one of the many fern things that I have. Of course, I've eaten ferns. You can eat them. I've seen them at farmers markets. You can eat fern cheese. This is from France. I've eaten fern cheese. Actually, when I visited a friend, she's from Alsace, she specifically bought me this cheese so I could eat it because she knows I'm obsessed with ferns. I also have fern artwork, and so this is some art I have in my living room just over there. It's over on the wall. And then I have so many fern things. And so the great thing about talking to you today from my house is that I can show you how kind of crazy obsessed I am with ferns. And so I have my fern mug over here. There it is, my beautiful fern mug. No, that way. Okay. I also have a fern notebook. There we go. And you can see it's got the different life stages. Here's the heart-shaped structure there. I also have a fern drink bottle. You can see how ridiculous. This is just a small amount of stuff that I have that's got ferns on it. And I have this fern. It's called a kokedama, where it's a Japanese art where you wrap the root ball in, let me see if I can move my hand. There we go. You wrap the root ball in moss. And so this is actually a bird's nest fern, and there's some little baby leaves coming through. But I made this about 2 or 3 weeks ago, but I don't have a name for this fern. So I would like all of you to help me and type in what you think I should name this fern. So that's my crowdsourcing goal for all of you out there today, is to help me name this little bird's nest fern. Okay, so I'm pretty obsessed with ferns. I didn't wear my fern. I also have a fern scarf. I have fern earrings, fern jewelry. I didn't wear those because I thought it'd be too much. But I would have been right at home in the Victorian times. And this is a picture of Victoria that was shown on PBS. And I've been watching this show for many seasons, and I've been really disappointed because they don't show ferns on there. And people were obsessed with ferns in the Victorian times. They were so obsessed that they actually called it Fern Fever. And so this was a crazy hobby that people were totally into. So it's kind of like my fern craziness that I have. And what they thought was that fern collecting made you intelligent. It showed that you were very clever, that you were virile, and it was just good for your mental health. And really, it was one of those few things that it allowed women to go out. They allowed women to go out unchaperoned and do. And so it was a hobby that a lot of women took up. And so during this fern fever, people had fern things on for everything. So of course they had all these different pots and plates that had ferns on them. They had furniture that had ferns on them. In this case, this is a writing desk, and this had that had ferns on it. They had fern wallpaper. They had fern sort of fencing, everything. They also wore fern clothes, and this is my dream dress, I think. This is a ball gown worn to the governor's ball in Victoria, Australia, where I come from. And so the ferns were embroidered on this beautiful dress. They also had fern jewellery. There's ferns adorning these beautiful stones. And they also, of course, collected ferns, so much so that some species are now almost extinct because the Victorians in the UK collected them so much that they pretty much decimated a lot of populations. And so this lady, she was collecting ferns to sell them to collectors. So this was her job. And you can see she's got a tiny little fern in her hand and a basket of ferns on her back that she's going to sell to those collectors or just all the enthusiasts in the UK. People also went out collecting ferns as a hobby, and this is like an engraving of people out collecting ferns. And this actually has a really cute story where there's this lady over in the middle, and she has her trowel, and she's just collected this fern, and she's like, putting on the moves with this guy, and they're talking about the ferns, and he's really interested in her ferns. But this lady here, she's like, oh, I've caught myself on my skirt on this plant, on this, this branch. And so she's vying for the attention over this guy and trying to get his help. But he is all about this lady and her newly collected ferns. And so ferns were all the rage back then. And we have an amazing collection of ferns at the California Academy of Sciences. And one of the collections that we have is this book. And this was this photo of me was in the advertising for this talk. This book is actually a book of ferns that were collected in the 1800s during the Fern Fever. And what people would do was make their collections of ferns and bind them into these kinds of books. And so in this book, these are just a few of the pages that I'm going to show you. It's so beautiful, the different arrangements of the ferns. And so in this case, they have this particular fern that they collected in Portland, Oregon in 1882. This fern is from South America. That was collected in 1882 as well. And this one is the one from Australia. This is actually one from a tree fern. And this was also collected in 1882. And so I could leaf through this book and just sort of marvel at all of these pages and take photos of every single one because they're all so beautiful. And this was really a common thing to do back in the Victorian times. And another example that we have, and this one isn't bound, but was that what they would do is they would arrange them in these beautiful displays. And so this features about 4 or 5 different species of ferns. And this was so one of the other things that they would do was make these beautiful displays. And there's about 30 pages like this in the Academy in our collections too. This one is a collection from Australia, and so these are all native Australian species. And you can see again that arrangement is also really similar. And so, we talk about things going viral today. It was definitely, back in Victorian times, that fern craze was totally viral. And everybody all around the world, so in the Pacific Northwest, in Australia, in the UK, they were all crazy about ferns. They also had these Victorian ferneries that they made in conservatories, and this one is an example in Scotland. But a lot of these conservatories that you see, they all started back in the Victorian times that allowed them to grow ferns. One of the problems was that if you weren't rich and you didn't have your own conservatory, you couldn't grow ferns in your house because, especially if you were in London, it was really polluted and they couldn't grow ferns. And so one of the big game changers was this discovery by Nathaniel Ward. He actually had, he was into collecting mosses. Again, he was a doctor as well, a medical doctor. He was totally into collecting moths. And so he had a tube with moths in them. And the tube was sealed. And what he found was that there was a fern and a grass in that sealed tube, and they just grew. They grew and they produced leaves. And he realized that you can grow plants in these sealed environments. So instead of having this huge conservatory, you create like a little mini conservatory. And so he wrote a book about it. And so he called it On the Growth of Plants in Closely Glazed Cases. And so he was able to grow ferns in his cases that he hadn't been able to grow because of the pollution in London. And this was a really significant find. And people started manufacturing it, and then they were able to grow ferns in their houses. And so there were catalogues full of different kinds of fern Wardian cases that you could buy, different prices, different sizes, for whatever you wanted to do. And so again, that really helped the fern market take off, and that sort of craze to keep going. And that's a precursor to your terrarium. So if you have a terrarium at home, that's what it came from Ward's fern case. So next time you look at your terrarium, you have a link back to those Victorian crazy fern people. So those terrariums, those fern cases, actually allowed people to go all across the world and collect even more ferns. The first time they ever used the Ward case on the ship, sort of internationally, was when they sent a ship to Australia. So they sent some plants over to Australia in that case, and then they actually sent some ferns back to the UK in that case. Previously, they had tried to send plants back and forth, but they couldn't because the sailors just didn't know how to keep them alive. And of course, conditions are really tough on a ship. And so all of these plants died. And so this enabled them to exchange plants from all around the world. It actually allowed the trade of things like bananas and tea plants. And so it really influenced a lot of our society. But they then sort of created this new sort of craze where they started collecting ferns from all over. So of course they collected ferns from Australia, and they went as far as the US and even to the deserts in the US. And in fact, somebody was collecting ferns in the deserts in the US and actually died in trying to collect some ferns. So this is how far that they went in trying to find all these different species. So I wanted to tell you about my work and how I have gone all around the world and looked for ferns. So I want to sort of take you on a field trip, kind of like a crazy Victorian person, and how I have gone to find ferns for my work. And so I am from Australia, as you can tell from my accent, and as I mentioned. So I have collected ferns in the wet tropics in Australia, and so that's where the circle is and where that sort of that starred pointer is. So I went there probably about 6 or 7 years ago to collect ferns. The wet tropics is absolutely beautiful. It's teeming with life. It's just a little bit outside of Cairns. This is the Daintree Rainforest. It's a national rainforest forest, and it's listed on the World Heritage List as well. It's that significant. And so what I did was I went on a field trip with my colleague Petra, and we went with 2 students. And so you can see Petra on the far right, and this is an amazing fig. You look at those are buttress roots. They're as enormous as an individual person. And those are just growing naturally in the forest, of course. We also collected ferns, of course. That was our reason for going to the forest. And the forest is it looks like a jungle. It's pretty impressive. And so over here on the far left, this fuzzy bit here is a fern. And this is a fern that grows in really moist environments. It's called a filmy fern, and the reason they call it this is because the leaf is only 1 cell layer thick. So of course, if it dries out, it's like it's dead. So it needs to be moist all the time. And so these are super, super delicate little ferns. Here's a tiny little mushroom, so you can see how small these individual ferns are. They're one of my favourite ferns. We also, of course, have ferns growing on other plants, and so we need to use some pretty special equipment to get to them. And so here we have a sort of shears on a big pole, and Petra here is directing Emma, the student, on what fern that she should cut down for our collection. And here we are with that particular fern. And this is like a really weird fern. You can see it's like a long ribbon. So it's starting in Petra's hand here, and it goes all the way down to the ground. So this is how big the leaf is. And again, Petra has 2 more fern leaves here in her hand too. And here's the bag that we collected all of our specimens in. Ferns also grow in some kind of drier environments as well. And so this was a little bit inland from that place, the Daintree, where we were before. And we went to this place on maybe like the 4th day of the field trip, and I was recovering from a cold. And so I sort of collected a few things, but those guys were out and collecting a lot. This is one of the climbing ferns. So the leaves form on a vine, more or less, and it just twirls all around an existing tree. So that's one of the unusual forms of ferns, which is a climbing fern. We have those ferns that grow in other plants, and so this one is growing on a branch of another plant. And this is another of my favourite ferns. It's what we call the basket ferns. And these here, these brown bits, they're actually individual leaves, and those leaves form as brown bits. They actually never become green. And the reason they form is because they create a basket, and in that basket, so there's a whole bunch of leaves that form as to become a basket, and all the like leaf matter and bits and pieces and dirt ends up in there, and it creates its own basket for the fern to grow in. And these upright leaves here are what are the photosynthetic part of the plant. So you've got the basket at the bottom and then that photosynthetic part at the top. It's pretty amazing. This fern has created its own container to grow in. And so this is Petra with her glasses on, because it reminds me to tell you the story of when we went to that particular site, and Petra came up to me and said to me, "Do I have something in my eye?" And I looked at her eye and she had a leech in it. This is my favourite fern story of all time. So she actually had a leech in it. And so I went and quickly tried to make up a saline solution to try and get the leech to detach from her eyeball. And then one of the students, Emma, came along and she opened Petra's eye and then pulled out the leech from off her eyeball. So that day that I took this photo, we went to the hospital and she was totally fine. They gave us some antibiotics and it was her eyes are totally fine. But apparently this is a really common thing. A lot of botanists end up out in the forest when it's raining. Of course, who else would do that? And a lot of botanists get leeches in their eye, which is what we found from local botanists. And so be careful if you're ever out in the rain in an Australian rainforest, is what I would remind you to do. And so another field trip, much less eventful, is when a whole bunch of the academy team, we all went to Penang in Malaysia. And you can see Malaysia is north of Australia, just there near Singapore. And we went to the coast of Malaysia on this tiny little island called Penang. And so a whole bunch of academy scientists collected plants and animals, all these different organisms for 2 weeks. And we went up the Penang Hill every day. And so you can see down here is Georgetown. And we went up the hill and collected plants. And it was just an absolutely impressive place to collect. To be so close to nature while just being in a city was really amazing. And so we just spent a lot of time walking, and that's what we do as botanists, is we walk slowly usually, and keep our eye out for different plants. Some, of course, there's lots of ferns around, and we collect everything, but sometimes there's things that are more rare, and that's the hard part, is that you want to have a really good eye to find the things that are really rare. And so one of the funny things was that we would walk down this trail every single day, and this was a paved trail in the Habitat, and that's the group that hosted us. They have an eco-tourist trail, and we walked past this rock every single day. And next to it was this other rock, and you can see me sort of peering off the rock, and there was, on this rock, this tiny fern. I probably discovered it on my, I don't know, third or fourth last day. So we'd been there for like a week and a half until I saw this tiny little fern. And I have normal hands. I don't have, giant hands or anything. And so that fern fits in the palm of my hand. And remember those reproductive structures, the sori, all those blobs, that's what produces the spores. And so you can see that this tiny little fern is mature and it produces spores at this stage. This fern is actually a new species. This has never been recorded anywhere in the world. I had a student who did the DNA work on this, and she also looked at the different structures, and so many of these structures are unique in this fern that we're calling it a new species. We haven't decided what we're going to call it yet, so maybe if anyone has some ideas on that too, please let us know. And so in contrast, this was also along the trail, this huge tree fern. So this is the crown of the tree, and the base goes all the way down to the bottom, down to the bottom over there. So it just shows you how remarkable ferns are, that you can get this tiny little fern growing right next to this giant fern. And so also I wanted to show you how we collect ferns. And so this has a bunch of different species of the forking fern family. And what's cool about this family is that the leaves produce a branch and then it divides, it forks. The leaves will produce another branch and then forking again, it forks again. And so you can see these sort of V shapes all through, and those V shapes are where the ferns are forked. And so here we are, we're collecting the ferns. And again, here's my bag full of all these ferns. And we collect these ferns and we put them in our collections for a whole bunch of different reasons. And so I'm going to show you the whole process of how we collect a fern and we keep it in our collections. So first thing is, of course, I have to sort through all of those different ferns. And I cut them into pieces that fit basically into the size of a newspaper. And so you can see here's a bunch of newspapers and a bunch of newspapers. And so it's kind of crazy. Whenever I'm out in the field, I'm kind of obsessed with finding newspapers. So we go all over and I'm like, do you have newspaper? Do you have newspaper? And so we collect, days old newspaper to do this. So then we press the fern leaf in between sheets of newspaper. And that's about as complicated as it gets. And so this is exactly the kind of thing that you do, if you collect a beautiful flower and you press it between the leaves, the pages of a book. This is exactly what we do. We just press them between the pages of a newspaper. And so we do this, I did this for a whole bunch of different ferns. And so you can see this huge stack. So you put a piece of fern in between newspaper, and then we put pieces of cardboard in between that newspaper. And the reason we put the cardboard in between is that it allows the air to flow through, and then that allows it to dry out much more quickly. Because if you imagine if you have just wads of newspaper, the air isn't going to circulate. So that cardboard also allows the air to circulate and also keeps them flat, so that we have a flat specimen that we can store easily. Then we tie it with bits of rope. So here we are sort of pressing that sort of bunch of specimens. And then we want it to be really flat. And so here I am standing on all those specimens to make sure they're totally flat. And we tighten that rope to keep them compressed. Once they're all dry, then they're flat, and we examine them back in the lab, in the office. And then the next stage is to put them on pieces of archival paper. Now, these pieces of paper are acid-free, and it allows us to store these plants indefinitely. And so this is a pretty recent example. And what you can see is that we record all of these different pieces of information about these plants. So it tells you who collected them, when it was collected. And so this one I can see was collected on the 25th of November, 2011. It says this one was actually cultivated, and it says where it was collected. And so we have this snapshot through time in our museum collections of biodiversity, of what was growing in a particular place at a particular time. So this is really an incredible record of life on Earth. And so we store all of these specimens in a herbarium. And so these are the cabinets of the Cal Academy Herbarium. We have huge rooms with all hundreds of cabinets, each storing all of these specimens. And so if you open one of the cabinets, this is what it looks like. We have these different folders. The folders represent the different regions in the world. And so this is an example of ferns that were collected. And again, you can see it's exactly the same format, that we have the ferns on the archival paper, and we have a label that records all that different information. And I've written we have 2 million specimens, but actually we don't even know how many specimens we have. We have maybe 2.5 million herbarium specimens. And the reason we don't know is because we're still databasing all of this. And so as we database, we find more specimens, and we just don't know how many we have. And so this is really a monumental task. And we're only 1/4. So we've databased about 500,000 specimens so far. So if you're looking to volunteer, the Academy is always looking for people to help us with our databasing. And these plants can be stored indefinitely, as I said before. And so these are 2 ferns that or fern fragments that were collected by Alfred Wallace. And so Wallace was, he was really a co-discoverer of evolution. So at the very same time that Darwin had his paper read out on evolution, Wallace, who lived in Borneo, also had his paper read out on evolution. And so they both told the world about evolution at exactly the same time. But Wallace actually doesn't get a lot of recognition for it. It was, and he considered himself more junior to Darwin, and so he was happy to let Darwin take the limelight for this amazing discovery. But Wallace is loved amongst biologists, and he lived in Southeast Asia for most of his life. And these are some ferns that were collected, that he collected so over 100 years ago. And they still are really beautiful, and they still preserve all the information about the appearance of those ferns from back then. And so we use ferns for in the collections for all these different kinds of reasons. And here I've just got just a handful of examples, but I could talk for hours about how we use these different specimens and how important fern specimens or specimens are in general to helping us understand the world. And so we can use ferns to help us understand biodiversity. And this example here is a fern that was collected in 1912 in Queensland in Australia, so near where I showed you where the field trip was. What is really remarkable about this fern is that it no longer exists in the wild. It's grown in sort of cultivated collections, but this is an example of a fern that no longer exists in where you can find it outside in the natural environment. And so this is why these collections are so important, because now we know this fern grew in this particular place. This is another example of some work that I've done using herbarium collections and also living collections. We can actually extract DNA from these collections, and we can use them to figure out the family tree and tell us which different species are closely related to each other, and what the names of the plants are if we don't know what they are. And then we can use these herbarium specimens to help us describe new species. And this particular specimen is from the Los Angeles region from 1912. And again, no, actually, I think it's from earlier. And so we can use this to compare anything that we find to this particular species. And if the new species has characters that are unique compared to what we know in our collections, then it allows us to describe a new species. And so with that, I want to say thank you all for tuning in, for joining me for breakfast or dinner or whatever time of day it is. I hope that you have enjoyed the ferns as much as I have sharing this information with you today. And I love this photo. It was a wildlife sort of comedy photo. And this moose, is that a moose? I don't know, is eating some ferns in a really hilarious way. Anyway, thank you so much.
Hi, Natalie. That was amazing. Thank you.
Thanks, Laurel.
We had hundreds and hundreds of people watching from Japan to Ferndale, Michigan.
Ferndale.
Have you been there? And these people have questions. You ready for some?
Yeah.
Okay, so Sarah from Facebook would like to know what the largest fern in the world is.
Oh, okay. So there's those king ferns that I showed you with Andy next to it. And so those are, I don't know feet, but this is like, they can be like 3 meters long. So they're really, those leaves are really enormous. There's like all these different ways of talking about the largest ferns. There's also tree ferns that can be like as tall as like a 2-story apartment building. And then you can have climbing ferns that can, grow even taller than that as they climb on the branches of trees. So there's all these kind of like different records of ferns in different ways.
Oh, cool. Let's see, Lynn G from YouTube wanted to ask whether there's a special name for the bumps the sori make on the top of the leaf.
Oh, no, there isn't. I don't know. Maybe there is, but I don't know.
Let's crowdsource that one too, because we got some really good ones for your pet fern. I'll save those for the end.
Oh, great. Okay. Yeah.
Mary A from Facebook wants to know whether there are medicinal aspects to any ferns.
Not that I can think of. I think people have eaten bracken fern, but actually, and so you have to be careful. I guess it's the opposite, where you can, if you eat too much bracken fern, it's actually carcinogenic, and you can get throat cancers because you eat too many ferns. Medicinally, I don't know. No, I know you can eat them. I haven't seen anything.
Okay.
Maybe I think. Okay, as you talk, maybe I might think of something.
Yeah, if we think of something, we can also loop back and answer more questions and comments later. We won't read all of them, so we've got a lot. Andrea D from YouTube asked whether the video of the sporangium's opening was sped up or real time.
No, that's totally real time.
Oh,
and
wow.
So that's why I love making that little pew sound, because it's like a catapult. And they completely get flicked and dispersed that quickly. And that's why I didn't mention, but that mohawk, it allows the structure to sort of hold part of its shape, and it's like a spring, and so it flicks back on that mohawk part. So that mohawk is really important in allowing it to like spring back and forth.
Oh, cool. Well, this is a related question. Jason from Facebook asked, is there a record for how far a fern can flick a spore? Oh,
I don't think that's been measured.
Oh, I feel like it should be. Yeah.
Yeah, we could do that. But the thing is that once they flick that spore, then they go, onto the air currents, because they're so tiny, then they can go all around the world. And so there's been studies, like people have gone like up in planes and collected, air from up in planes, and they found fern spores, that high into the atmosphere.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. I feel like also, but these kinds of experiments sound worthwhile, I think, considering your pyrotechnics. Like, this seems like the next step. Let's see. Jay Gomez from YouTube asked, I think he would like you to elaborate a bit more on he asked, what is the field note process for ferns? So perhaps like the information recorded or, field notes, I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so what we do is, and I didn't show that, but is we have like a notebook, and we write down all of the different things. So if I go out into the field and I collect a fern, I will write my collector number. And so I have an ongoing list of number of plants that I've collected through time. Some collectors, they're up into like 15,000, 20,000 plants that they've collected. And so you write down the number. So say I'll write down number, 570. And I write down the latitude. I get a GPS out and I'll say I have that, this is where I collected this fern at this particular GPS location. I put that in my notebook. Actually, my partner Magnus does all the record keeping. And so he'll write that down, and then we write down the area that we collected it from, what it looked like, was it growing, on a rock? Was it growing in a stream? What that name of the forest was, who else was there. So it's actually kind of a cool record. So I will write my last name, and anyone else who was on that field trip and who helped collect that plant, their name goes onto that collecting label as well. And so we record all of that. And we also can record things like what other plants were growing nearby, anything that is important. Some people, write some crazy notes associated with their field notes, and that's often fun. I think some people write, when they're like fighting with people in their field notes and things like that. But we then go back into, at the end of the day, what I usually do is just type all of those notes up on my computer after I press the plants. And so then I have that sort of permanent record, and it's sort of fresh in my mind about, what was there at that time. And so then we put that on the label, and we put that with the specimen, and it's there for perpetuity. And so, we've got specimens that are 200 years old, and that information is there forever.
Yeah. Well, this is a set of questions actually related to collections as well. So one is from Earlene Millier, and one's from Lacey Benson. And they ask, how long are the spores viable, and do you store viable spores in collections as well?
That's a really good question. And so there's some group of ferns where the spores are actually green, and those ones are photosynthetic. They have chloroplasts in them, but they don't actually last for very long. And so when we look at those ferns, you find that they don't have a really wide distribution, because the fern spores don't get sort of spread all around the world. Other spores can last for indefinitely, really. And so fern growers have like a spore exchange. And so if you harvest the fern spores properly, you can exchange it with different people. And in fact, a friend of mine, they got married, and they, as party favors, they collected fern spores and they gave it to their friends as party favors.
That's so good.
We're all kind of crazy about ferns. So I was so thrilled to get those. I can't grow ferns though, so I haven't even tried to grow those. But in terms of the collections, what we can do is we store the leaves, and then any sort of things that fall off these specimens, we keep them in a little packet. And so those packets are associated with the leaves in the herbarium. And which reminds me that what we have done in the past is we've grown some plants from spores from the collections, and we've used those for DNA study, because of course the DNA is much more fresh when it's a living plant. And so we collect the spores, grow them into plants, and then use those for research.
Oh, that's cool. And you're fern obsessed, but we should say too that that's not your only area of study. Do you want to mention the other?
Yeah, so I work on a different group of plants called cycads. And so most people will know them as sago palms, and you can buy them at IKEA, and I've seen them all over. And they grow everywhere in the world. They're originally from Japan. And so those plants are really endangered. And so those are that's my second true love, is the cycads, and trying to conserve them in the face of them being the most endangered group of anything in the world.
And that's what we're going to try to get you to do another Breakfast Club talk about cycads later. So put your vote for that in the comment section to make her do it if you are interested. So from YouTube also we have username Kzamzao, who says, no one told me in college that there were jobs where you walk through the woods slowly. I think I would have become a botanist, which is a good way of asking how you became a botanist. Yeah, so
I didn't even know that you could be a scientist when I was growing up. I loved the environment. I was in my teens when I learned that the environment was, in peril. And so I started growing a garden. because I wanted to be more sustainable. And then I went to university and did a science degree and worked on plants. And I then realized that I could keep doing work on plants and doing research. And so I just sort of followed this passion where I found this passion sort of as, you know, as a person at university. And so I think that's really important to remember that, you know, as kids, we say to everyone, like, you know, what do you want to be when you grow up? And you just, sometimes you don't even know. Sometimes these jobs don't even exist. Like, you know, your job, Laurel, as, you know, someone who does social media and digital engagement, like that didn't exist as we were growing up. And, you know, for me as a botanist, I didn't even know you could be a botanist as you're growing up. So I think there's a lot to be said for, you know, discovering your passions and not having to figure it all out so early.
Yeah, that's lovely. I'm glad that you said that, and I'm glad that we talked about it. We see that as a trend with a lot of our scientists, right? So it's nice to say it's not always a straight line.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Cool. Well, are you ready to hear some fern name suggestions?
Yes. Okay.
Okay. So these are the ones I got a couple. Bob, Fernando, Wilson, Fernie, Coco, Jules Fern, Fernie Sanders. And then here's what I think might be your favorite.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm just going to say. So Julia from YouTube suggested Diana, which sounds, you know, kind of close, but it's because Diana Prince was the civilian identity of Wonder Woman.
Oh.
That's how you might like it.
That's a good one. There's so many good ones.
Yeah, I know. There's more too. That's just like a good handful. But and we got some questions about how to care for the kokedama. But I know that your dark secret is that you're actually not very good at keeping things alive, right?
I'm terrible. So this is my like quarantine project. So I have a whole bunch of ferns at the academy, and I actually gave it to somebody else to take home to look after. She said, "No, you can take them home." I was like, "No, please don't let me look after these plants because I will kill them." And so this is like my special quarantine project to keep the plant alive. So I hope that I can report that it is alive at the end of quarantine, because I have killed so many ferns. It's kind of terrible.
Yeah.
I kill them with love. That's the problem.
With overwatering and
too much
hard, heavy embraces. Yeah. Well, I should say too, a lot of people are also really interested in the volunteer information. So we'll go ahead and put links to that in the comment section of these. And I think that's all we kind of have time for today. But thank you again so much for doing this.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much to everyone who watched. And if you enjoyed it, please check out the full lineup of upcoming Breakfast Club speakers, 10 a.m. on select days throughout the week. And you can see the schedule for that at the link we just dropped in the comments, or by going to calacademy.org and visiting our Academy at Home webpage, which has a ton of resources for anyone looking for stuff to do while at home, including this series. And then I'm just going to close by mentioning two really cool upcoming things. First, for anyone familiar with our regular 21 and over nightlife series, that's obviously on hold for the moment, but we're taking that one virtual as well. So this Thursday night at 7 p.m. Pacific, tune in for cocktail lessons, shark science, artists, musicians, self-care, and more. And then that same Thursday in the morning, come right back here at 10 a.m. for our next Breakfast Club speaker, Dr. Lauren Esposito, who's our curator of arachnology, and she'll be delivering a talk called When the Lights Go Out, Arachnid Sex. Yes. So, okay, that's it. We hope collectively, all of us from the Academy, that we made your Tuesday just a little bit better. And thank you again so much for joining us. Bye, Natalie. Bye, everyone.
Bye.